Welcome to the Future Campus webinar on the budget that was. We're delighted here to have an expert panel who will bring us a whole range of perspectives on last night's budget, what it means for the sector and where we're going from here. My name's Tim Winkler. We'll be joined soon by Stephen Matchett as well from Future Campus to host the meeting. And before we go on to introduce the guests, I just want to acknowledge the elders past and present, acknowledge the lands on which we all meet and work, and pay our collective respects to Indigenous people present here today and who are listening in the audience. We have a outstanding panel today. We're delighted to welcome Luke and Jenny. Thank you for joining. Hopefully you can hear us.
Can you hear us too?
Absolutely, we can hear you perfectly. So thank you. Luke, I have seen you across the airwaves all morning, so you must be almost talked out, but we'll look forward to your contributions. Jenny from TAFE Directors Australia, lovely to have you there as well. Adam Shoemaker from Victoria University, Vice-Chancellor, has made time in his day, as have Andrew Norton in between tweets. Thank you very much. And Professor Michelle Trudgett, who I'm really looking forward to getting her insights on a whole range of issues in relation to last night's document. So thank you very much for being here. Welcome. I want to dive straight in. Andrew, let's start with you. Can you give us your thoughts? What's your overview on this budget and what it means right now for the sector?
Well, I guess for the sector itself, a sort of corporate entities, there was really very little in it. So it's really aimed at students with the prac payments, with the indexation, and sort of starting to set us up for the future Australian Tertiary Education Commission. And so we're really headed to a very difficult period for the sector. So people are going to get major funding cuts via the cap on international students. And yet all the government is really offering is some extra payments for enabling students and a whole lot of extra regulatory costs. So we're headed for quite a difficult period. Tim?
That's a bracing summary there. Thank you, Andrew. Luke, what's your response to that, or response to those thoughts? Clearly, there seem to be a lot of challenges for the sector. Are you concerned?
Thanks, Tim, and thanks, Andrew. I'm quite optimistic about the in-principle agreement to a number of things, including the move towards developing a needs-based funding model for the system, for the sector. That's certainly what we need. There is inequity across the system in terms of international student enrolments, and there is differential demand for domestic students across the country. So there is a need now for more than ever for institutions to have a funding profile that recognises where they deliver and for whom they deliver. And that's really important. Obviously, the budget doesn't speak to how they'll fund that. They've promised to develop a Tertiary Education Commission with the first job of that to develop the needs-based funding model, as well as a student managed growth system for domestic students, as well as at the same time, however we can fit that in within a managed growth system and uncapping of places for students from equity backgrounds. So there's some really good, promising signs in there. But yeah, Andrew's spoken, and correctly, as he always does, that there is some anxiety in our system about how the systemic funding needs to flow into higher education and universities to ensure that we're ready. And my message to the government really is that we want to be match ready. We want to be match fit to be able to do the big uplift that's required, and in terms of particularly the 80% post-secondary education attainment rates and more than 50% of that coming from higher education. We're not at the moment, and we need to make sure we are. So a combined factor of international student managed growth as well is going to be a considerable factor to think about how we navigate that through. So we'll be making the case pretty strongly to the government that we need to ensure that we have growth in in international education that is important for us to keep doing what we do.
Luke, just on that, a follow-up question for you. You've mentioned needs-based and managed growth funding. There's also the caps. They all need to be developed simultaneously, effectively. Obviously, there's slightly different implementation times, but that's essentially 3 systems and without a bureaucracy to implement. Does that not cause some anxiety?
Oh, look, Tim, there's always anxiety in this sector, and I could have a very long shopping list of issues that keep me awake at night, but I won't bore everyone. What I'll say is that the Accord Implementation Advisory Committee, which is announced today, will have the job of advising on how to develop an Australian Tertiary Education Commission. That will start on the 1st of July 2025, pending legislation, obviously. And then the new needs-based funding system will start on the 1st of January 2026. Those of you who've been around this sector a long time realise that we can start doing the work before we have the agency or the statutory body. And we certainly did that with TEXA and some other, regulatory changes back in the day. So the work really starts now, and we've got to get on with it. So that's our message from my point of view, and making sure that we can sequence all of those things. The international student managed growth arrangements, we will be in a very intense period ahead of negotiation with the government on what that looks like. We're yet to see, I've only just been talking to, our Vice-Chancellors at the board level, but I'll continue to talk to people from right across the sector, including Jenny, around how that will impact the whole tertiary education sector. We want to make sure we get certainty and stability in that. As you alluded to earlier, Tim, I've been talking to a lot of media folk today. This is an important sector for the country, but it's also a critical funding source for what we do in the tertiary education system in Australia. And we can't just, stop it or throw it out. So we need to make sure it's preserved and growing.
Jenny, the perfect segue to you. Big day yesterday, big day today for you. There's a lot of work ahead. Where's your concerns, and where's your optimism in terms of the budget and its outcomes?
So let's start with optimism. Announced last week at the TDA Convention 2024 and was from Minister O'Connor the potential for TAFEs at the AQF 5 and 6 level to have self-accreditation. Now, TDA has been pushing for that because if we are to have some sort of integration, the current structures of policy, funding and regulation that sit within VET have not been conducive to working in any harmonised way with higher education. So we welcome that 27 odd million that will be going towards looking at what does harmonisation mean. An easy sentence to write. We've been talking about this for a very long time and a much harder thing to do. But for the first time, I think the optimism is we're seeing some recognition that some of the policy settings that have made it really difficult are going to shift a bit. So that's the positive. I'll put my TAFE hat firmly on now and say the size and scale of the fee-free university-ready preparation courses does pose a risk, and it does pose a risk for the higher levels of TAFE and for vocational education and training. So I think we have some real strengths here in terms of the government looking towards how do we harmonise across for a tertiary sector. We've got a scoping study on the Tertiary Education Commission coming our way. But then we also see another policy agenda, which, albeit in its own right, looks great and is great, when I put a TAFE hat on, has the potential for two sectors perhaps to come together less and to compete. So we're going to have to balance a range of those policy agendas I think, in a collaborative way, which might be a bit Pollyanna-ish, if you like, but you know, the natural instinct will be for competition. And I've lived in jurisdictions where we've seen at the sub-degree level competition. So with the higher levels of TAFE. But I'm going to weight it on the side of optimism, because I think there is a genuineness, especially for the TAFEs component, our public educators within vocational education, which are educational organisations, to remove some of the shackles and to actually recognise the role of dual sectors. And I just don't mean dual sector universities that Adam is representing. I also mean the very size and scale of somewhere like TAFE New South Wales, which is a dual sector TAFE with multiple higher education qualifications and already on the pathway towards self-accreditation with TEXA for higher education qualifications. And half our members in TDA are higher education providers outside of our dual sectors. I think there is, for the first time in a long time, some recognition you can't achieve those aspirational statements just by words alone. You've got to change some of the policy and regulatory settings, and some of that we're seeing.
Just one follow-up question before I go to Adam. Are you concerned? There seems to be a range of different papers and policies coming out at the moment in fairly rapid fire progress from the government. Are you concerned that a lot of the nomenclature is around universities? There is fewer mentions of TAFE. The budget documents itself seem to talk often about university. Is there a concern there's a substitution between institution and university to become people talking about universities rather than a more inclusive term?
Well, no, I actually don't think that is the case, Tim. I think it might be the case if you live and work predominantly in higher education. That's what you see. But the National Skills Agreement was signed at the end of last year, and the National Skills Agreement is the agreement in the vocational sector that makes the funding flow between the federal government and all the states and territories. There's significant policy agendas in that, and the one that really sticks out, which is potentially a vehicle that can be used for some of this harmonisation, is the TAFE Centres of Excellence and the leadership in the TAFE Centres of Excellence. So I think we always knew the response to the Universities Accord would come in the budget. We also have experienced in vocational education already the Minister O'Connor's response and the government's response through the National Skills Agreement, which has been completely out in the public domain now for the last 5 months. So that might be because of the space that Future Campus plays in more than we play in, which is we've seen both, if anything, we know our vocational change map, if you like. Our strategies have been there now for quite a number of months. And we had our TDA convention last week with over 550 delegates, and we're already talking about implementation of some of those big ticket items that are in the National Skills Agreement. So I think today, yes, there's a public voice around universities. I think for the last few months, from our point of view, it's been very dominant around the National Skills Agreement and what it means.
Right, thank you, Adam. This seems to be the perfect moment to cross to you. You're at the helm of a dual sector institution. What does the budget mean to you?
Look, I was really listening carefully to what Jenny had to say, and congrats on being on the next stage of the development of this too, Jenny, because it's crucial to be shepherding it in the right direction. So I believe I'm actually pretty guardedly optimistic about everything. Look, the truth is we actually, as a UA, and I'm on the board of UA as well, called for student-centric reforms very strongly. They came, and students called for them too. So there's a lot to like in that regard. Okay, you've got to admit that never before have I seen a collection of things which talk to student safety, affordability, prac placements in the way that this is terrific stuff from a student point of view. And if you're saying access and equity matters, and we're a place that really says that, Jenny would know that well, we're delighted with that side of it. Okay, so that's 100% delighted with that. And the rest is, of course, to be worked through, and so much is contextual. So if I'm in Darwin and I'm talking with Scott Bowman, I'd be thrilled with the outcome today. Medical placements for new medical school, and First Nations dedicated placements for medicine. It's incredible. So it really depends on where you're sitting. And I think that that's really what you're saying too. I think, Jenny, is that the context will be crucial when we're talking about harmonization. With whom, how fast, and for whom. with whom, half-assed, and for whom. So we want to be part of that mix, of course. And I agree with Jenny too, that the National Skills Agreement is absolutely crucial. The Jobs and Skills Councils, very influential, and we should not forget that they are absolutely working already. So this isn't just something in the future, it's up and running very actively, monitoring and doing. So to summarize, in a dual sector university, we think the time has come to be even more unified. We call it one VU in our own backyard, but for all of them, you know, very much the case, because I can think that harmonization is best evoked by doing that in tandem and not internal competition. Before, as you said, you know, we do not want any internal competition between TAFE and higher ed, or external if we can avoid it. There is going to be a problem there with the international caps, separate topic, get to that in a minute. But I think an overarching response is guardedly optimistic.
Interesting. Well, that's left me with many more questions to ask. I will just drop in and say, Stephen, welcome. We've just been going through initial responses to the budget, and I'll hand over to you in just a moment, but we'll go first to Michelle. Michelle, there in the Indigenous space, the Accord final report promised much and many changes, and there has been a range of expectations around what will happen next. What were your thoughts? Were you pleased with the budget?
Thanks, Tim. To be honest with you, the budget indicates that there'll be $110 million for Indigenous education, but that's spread across early childhood, schools, and higher education. When you actually break it down and analyse where it's getting filtered to, it's very evident that it will be more at the school-aged cohort. So, for example, of that 110 million, the Clontarf Foundation got nearly 33 million. The Australian Indigenous Education Foundation, 27.5 million. So there's already half the pot gone. While those organisations do amazing work and great things, in my opinion, there is next to no increase at all in terms of funding for programs to improve Indigenous participation and outcomes in higher education and research. I think that was a big miss. In saying that, I do acknowledge that the Guaranteed Commonwealth Supported Places for Indigenous Students was announced post interim Accord report, which was very welcome by the Indigenous colleagues in the sector. There's also other things in the budget that aren't Indigenous specific, but I'm sure will be welcomed by colleagues. So, for example, the $1 million to establish an inquiry into racism in the university sector. That's fantastic. That's a great initiative. But overall, I was expecting post-Accord that there would be targeted funds to do some of, you know, if we're talking about putting Indigenous people at the heart of the sector, I don't see the resources that are going to support that. Yeah. And for me, that's a big disappointing factor. It's been overlooked, I think, to be honest, Tim.
Were you also, I thought that the Indigenous review would be announced as part of this. Is that a surprise? Because at the moment, we have not heard where that is, and it's a really significant bit of work. It's something that Indigenous leaders throughout the sector, many of us pushed hard for. As I'm sure colleagues will know, the last review in the Indigenous space, national space, was the Barrett Review of 2012. Now, if we look back in 2012, I think we had one Indigenous Deputy Vice-Chancellor and 2 Indigenous Pro-Vice-Chancellors in the sector. That was it. So much has changed in that 12 years that we absolutely need a review. And the review isn't overly costly, and I'm sure could have been part of that budget. Stephen, I think it's a good time to hand over to you. Can I hand the and I should also say, anyone who has questions, please enter them in the Q&A, and then I'll filter them through and interrupt as they come. But I'll hand over to you now, Stephen.
Thanks, and apologies for the my delay, the vicissitudes of Sydney traffic, and you can't get Wi-Fi in all the tunnels, unfortunately, of which there are many in Sydney. Anyway, I am here now with apologies. Have we talked about the only real winners, as I said, in the budget, and that is TAFE? That was the question. Have we?
we have started with some discussions about TAFE, and Jenny's given us her thoughts on TAFE getting quite a good run pre-budget and less exposure in the latest budget, if that's a fair synopsis.
Well, I'd congratulate Jenny on being announced as a member of the ATEC advisory committee to oversee the legislation. I think that's pretty. I think that's pretty impressive that the government does see this as being, to an extent, a unified system in the future, which really leaves us the real loser, as far as I can tell, is the research community. Depends which research you're talking about. There was a bit more money for the NHMRC and 2 new funded missions for the Medical Research Future Fund. But as for the university research community, there ain't a lot in there, as far as I can tell. Is that right, Andrew Norton?
Well, there's going to be another review of research, which reads to me as really being about further alignment of what the sector is researching with the priorities of the government, which of course has been a very long-running theme. But I think what we're seeing here is kind of the final steps to really limit the amounts of curiosity-driven, research-driven research, and to really focus on what the government thinks the priority should be. So I guess for me, this is part of a very broad pattern of moving away from an autonomous sector towards a sector that's much more directed by government. And ATEC will be the key enforcer on the student side, and some mix of the research agencies and ATEC on the research side.
And a bipartisan policy. I mean, this does rather continue a lot of the work the previous government had in place.
That's true, and I think you could argue that the differences between them are actually fairly small at this point. You know, issues of detail rather than fundamental direction. And
the review, as I remember, is reporting to Minister Husick, not to Minister Clare.
Which could be another problem in the sense that he has obviously different ministerial responsibilities and priorities. So
priorities being crucial there. Last night, lobbies were doing the best they could with what they had and saying, "You beauty, here's another chance to end the evil research and development tax incentive." And I would have thought, given how hard the previous government tried to get rid of that and failed, that will not be easy.
Probably not. No. So it's really, I think the sector needs to be very clear that even though, of course, it is willing to work on national priorities, that is not its sole function.
Yeah. Luke Sheehy, you are indefatigably optimistic by nature. What is the good news in there for your members?
Well, Stephen, I talked about this earlier. It really is the commitments, right? The in-principle commitments to the needs-based funding, a demand-driven for equity students, the overall attainment rates in the system. So those big ticket equity and participation measures in the accord, while they're not in the budget papers in terms of funding, I'm led to believe that they will be in the future. However, we have to wait and see, for future budgets. So that's a good thing, but we really need to get that work moving quickly to, designing a needs-based funding model, for instance. I mean, drawing on the school example from Gonski, it's not going to take just 6 months, really. There's a lot of moving parts in it to get it right. It has a potential to significantly kind of fix some of those funding distortions I talked about before in the system, where it is increasingly more difficult for some universities to deliver based on a whole range of attributes at the moment, including where they are, but their student cohort, also domestic demand and international demand. So that's a good thing, but you want to get that right. So one of the things I think we should focus on, and we will, is what does the transition look like from point A to point whatever we get to? And we should be ready, just in case, and I talked about it before, that they are planning on implementing a needs-based funding model by calendar year 2026. Wildly optimistic in my view. So, we need to make sure that whatever of the transition that we put in place, and it needs to go more than just the higher education funding guarantee we've seen in previous years. I think there's more bespoke arrangements per institution that needs to happen. So we'll certainly be looking at that as well and seeing how that might go into at least 26, because I suspect it'll be more like a 2027 proposition.
I don't know what you're talking to me, brother. Jenny Dodd's the woman you need to be speaking to, and she's right there. does seem to me that there is a talk of money in the out years, but the out years are inevitably out, as it were, when it comes to it. I'm also interested to see Stephen Duckett appointed to the advisory committee. Stephen Duckett wrote a paper I think it was a submission to the Accord, where he talked about needs-based funding models, which was very interesting indeed. And I wouldn't have thought necessarily it was going to please a lot of your members.
Well, I'll have to turn my attention to his submission. There was, 830 odd of them over the course of 16 months, Stephen. So, and I remember at a Senate inquiry on the job-ready graduates once, I was asked about the University of Sydney submission, and at the time I gleefully, told Senator Kim Carr that I had no interest in University of Sydney submissions. I do now because, of course, they're one of my great members. So, but nonetheless, no, I'll turn my mind to it. Look, there were some really wild and wonderful ideas in the Accord process, but I really do think this is the big moment. Needs-based funding, which allows each of the individual universities and other tertiary education providers within the system, hopefully, to contribute to not only their local economies and community, but have a kind of unique role within a national system. That for me is really exciting, but it's going to take a lot of work. And Jenny, you've got a big job ahead of you. You're right, Stephen. I should be lobbying Jenny, and others, including Verity Firth and and others on the panel. So we'll continue. As I mentioned, I'll be on speed dial. You shouldn't have got my number today, Jenny.
Earlier in the week, unless it was last, the skills minister announced that there would be a pilot for TAFEs, specifically TAFEs, to become self-accrediting. Now, I can't remember whether they said specifically self-accrediting for higher ed courses that they teach or self-accrediting in general. I think it might have been general. That strikes me. Sorry,
no,
Jenny?
it's not in general, just to clarify, because it wasn't clear in the minister's speech, but it is clear in what the intent was. We've been advocating through TDA for a long time for self-accreditation for TAFEs. That's one point. In the Accord piece of work, the Accord committee, one of their recommendations is self-accreditation for TAFEs in certain priority areas at the AQF 5 and 6 level, plus self-accreditation, which is already happening anyway, for TAFEs who are working with TEXA towards their higher education degrees. So there is a little bit of chatter around the sector at the moment saying it's self-accreditation for TAFE. It is, but it's actually quite narrow. And so we've had to pull back even our own members' understanding. The jobs, Adam referred to the Jobs and Skills Councils. The Jobs and Skills Councils have a very strong carriage within our vocational education and training sector as the voice of industry. And part of that is workforce development for industry, but also the training products that they own essentially. That will continue. There is no threat to any of that. This is around TAFEs as education institutions being able to work in many ways through the TAFE Centres of Excellence, the new way of partnering with the universities to actually respond to potential employer needs and specific local needs, taking off some of those shackles of units of competency constructs that have come through and been reaffirmed through the qualification reform process through VET most recently. So it is quite narrow, Stephen, but nonetheless, it's a really good beginning from our point of view, because it actually does say we need to be at the table, especially in that contested, if you like, space of the diplomas, advanced diplomas and undergraduate degrees. And we will have the ability to do that.
To which I'd just drop in for you and Adam Shoemaker, degree apprenticeships. And the potential for a TAFE with power to self-accredit can then move into the degree apprenticeship space. It becomes a whole new ambiguous territory between the two sectors, which brings them to a merger of sorts.
It will depend how degree apprenticeships where they are placed within the AQF, and there's some work happening out of the department around that at the moment. Our conversation around that is, if we're talking about degree apprenticeships, we have to think differently than the current way in which an apprenticeship model is constructed, which is largely based on job task outcomes. Even though there's a broadening through the qualification reform process, it's still very much occupationally based. This will require many more at degree apprenticeship level, generic skills, employability skills, however we want to refer to it, broader capabilities. That is the potential there for TAFE to be able to use educational expertise to help in that design. So you're quite right, that is an exciting component, but there are still some caveats around it depending on what's coming out of the department in terms of the way they're constructing that at the moment. And we've given initial feedback with some concerns that if you lock it down into a current status quo sort of structure model around units of competency, you're not going to achieve what we need to achieve, which is that broader ability to bring in both vocational education and higher education in a broader way in which a higher apprenticeship or a degree apprenticeship might be able to be rolled out.
Adam Shoemaker, are you going to follow, indeed, are you already following, say, University of South Australia that has now got that degree apprenticeship in some aspect of computer coding with BAE?
Well, we're not going to do that. As it turned out, we were in negotiation with that very firm, decided not to go down that route. So that's a no on that particular area and with that particular partner. But I can assure you that the area isn't just about degree apprenticeships. It's as you're saying, it's about right time, right place, uplift into skills which need to be happening for industry. The word apprenticeship is a bit misleading because it sounds like a 2 or 3 year side-by-side thing. I think it needs a new name and I think it needs a new aim, and I think we can together get it. And I think that's what Jenny's saying too. So answer is as clear as I can make it. But there's one other thing, Stephen, I'd like to introduce, which I think is for TAFE and for all of us, which we danced around, which is the whole managed approach to international student caps. Okay, if I may, because I think this is a big ticket item and a hot one. It is the case at the moment, and Jen, you could correct me if I get the figures wrong, but it's around 700,000 enrolled international students in Australia, and about 220,000 of those are allegedly at the level of VET, okay? Not TAFE, but VET, big difference, because most of those are in private colleges that have very few or no domestic students. So it seems to me that TAFE is missing out largely, as I mean public TAFE, which we love, and also dual sector dimensions on the benefits of international students in their bailiwick. Okay, that's something which I wouldn't mind asking you, Jenny, whether you're thinking about that, because that's a representation back, which I think it's going to matter a lot to get across it.
Oh, good question.
So if I may, Stephen and Tim, Adam's right. Only about 5% of the international student market is in public provision. The majority of it is in private training providers. The thing that has to be remembered here is that separately in the vet sector, there is a quantum of work happening around integrity. ASQA have been tasked to not just regulate on quality, but to regulate for integrity. And I think it's a really important distinguishing factor, and they've now got whatever it is, 30 odd million that they receive to actually roll out some of these integrity measures. There is certainly, I would say, opportunities in vocational education and training in the international student market in a way through public provision that haven't been realised. But at the moment, the reality is public provision only constitutes 4 to 5% of what is international students anyway. So that's probably a forward-looking process about what might happen. Given my understanding of what the current caps are around, in some ways there's limitations, and then there's the alignment for the universities with housing policy and other components that sit around that. So I think there's opportunities there into the future, and I think the government is looking at that.
I think very challenging for you. I mean, as Varghese, that's the right pronunciation, as Peter Varghese said in his report on doing business in India, it is very hard for Australian training to compete on price in the subcontinent. But this is now, this whole question of VET tied to immigration, tied to the credibility of courses, has now seeped into the public consciousness. I think there was a leader in one of the papers this morning, it might have been the Australian, actually touching on that, and I never thought I'd see the day when that ran. Luke, what's this going to mean insofar as you can tell at this stage? If there is going to be no more money, at least it appears to be in the short term, for research, how are your members going to maintain their existing lofty positions in the rankings?
Well, it's not just really about rankings, Stephen. It's about stability in the sector, right? And this, one of the things that international education and the income it gets from it provides a whole range of, certainty for what we can do. And universities have struggled on the current visa arrangements, many of them, because they've, the way it's been applied since December under those integrity categories, and the slowing down of visas deliberately based on only assessment of migration risk. This is a great challenge within the system to get that balance right between migration risk and education quality. I cannot believe we're still having this conversation. I mean, I was having this conversation when I worked for ministers many years ago, when we looked at, fixing the system in the late noughties, early 2010s, and the various reviews we did then. But this tension between migration and education quality, I think we also need to remind the Commonwealth that, and more broadly, the community, that in the higher education space in particular, 70% plus of the students that come onshore to take a course or a degree with us go home. So this kind of deliberate move to link it with the migration system and skills needs, I don't know if that's fit for purpose even as a concept, right? That's the first thing. I think the second thing is negotiations around what we need to do. And I think there needs to be a pretty clear articulation. I've talked about this before around transition arrangements. I don't think we've ever painted a clear enough picture around how the actual financial how the finances work of a university. And I think particularly as we have these long pipeline effects, some of our universities still are, recovering from COVID. Because once COVID hit, we knew it would be at least 2025, 2026 until we could potentially fully recover. Now, so there are big issues of moving issues in the system. Firstly, it was COVID, then we couldn't get international students. Then domestic students didn't want to come because, they wanted to go into a booming labour market in certain states. Now we're having curtailing of international students. So I think we need to come back to some basics, particularly when we're negotiating these transition arrangements, that say this is how much it costs to deliver a world-class education to an Australian student and deliver research in Australian universities. And this is how much we rely on international revenue for it. I don't think that story is well enough told at the moment. That will be part of the prospect we put to this idea around what we need for growth, for sustainability and certainty.
Which raises the question of compacts. I mean, I think you were around when Kim Carr was determined that this was going to be a new model, and it sort of never really, as far as I can tell, happened. Andrew Norton, is it going to be possible, insofar as anyone can tell, to negotiate 3 or 4 year arrangements between the Commission and universities that will provide funding, but give everybody the flexibility to respond fast to change?
I think the key issue here is at what level of detail is the regulation going to be. So this is an immediate issue for the international student caps. So my view is if it's regulated at the course level, as Luke said, this is a misguided policy to begin with. We should not outsource our skills needs to international students. But because the Commonwealth is fixated on the courses that students don't actually want to do, it will mean the capacity in the system is much, much lower in truth than the theoretical capped amount. And I'm concerned that ATEC will do the same thing for domestic students. They'll try and regulate at the course level to try and ensure skills supply. But the reality is students don't have to do these courses. And so we'll have, unused places in the courses that ATEC has prioritised. Meanwhile, universities are turning students away in other courses. And so simply won't reach our attainment targets, and we'll have a lot of disappointed prospective students.
Which you could also argue it applies to TAFE with Jobs and Skills Australia now projecting what the economy is going to need years out.
And this has actually been a thing in TAFE for a long time. We've heard these extraordinary lists of individually named courses and associated funding, which we've had a little bit of for new places in higher ed, but never before have we tried to run the whole system on that basis. And I think if we do, it'll be a total disaster.
Michelle, Trudgett and Adam Shoemaker, how does that look from your perspective? You're going to be sitting in meetings where you're basically saying, well, what do we ask for? And how do we know what we're going to need 5 years down the track?
Michelle, do you want to go first?
Sure, happy to, Adam. I think I think it's a really good question, Stephen. the crystal ball, really. And I think when it comes to Indigenous students, particularly, there's this increased competition amongst universities to secure Indigenous students and Indigenous staff, and that's currently in 2024. So where we're going to be in 5 years from now, I think that competition is going to increase significantly. One of the things from the Accord report was the fact that, you know, there's this call for Indigenous Australians to be at the heart of the sector, that self-determination was to be centred in the sector. But if we draw a parallel with the budget yesterday and the fact that there's no additional resources, trying to have foresight for 5 years from now is going to be a difficult conversation.
What about you? What about for a dual sector institution like VU?
Well, thanks, Stephen. Look, truth is, I agree with everything Michelle said about that line not being drawn, but here's what I believe. If we make our day jobs a research project, which is a good way of getting research done, we need some evidence in support of what Andrew's been saying too. Number one, I think it's the case that for many students, and I don't just mean those currently identified as equity students, but international students too, many of them are doing it tough and many are not rich at all, okay? There's a kind of assumption that there's a whole category of students coming to this country who are well-to-do. Not so. And if you think about it, the Nixon review showed that many of them are at risk or vulnerable, and that there's a lot of support needed, okay? So public institutions, public purpose institutions like TAFEs, like universities, like dual sectors, really go that extra mile to support those students from A to Z. And I think that's got to be recognized as part of it, just as they hopefully do the same with and for and in alignment with First Nation students. Like, that's part of the mission, okay? So what I'm saying to you is, put very clearly, I reckon that we need to recognize this absolute consistent excellence and measured support for students as part of this mix. So in the transition arrangements, we've got to recognize that it isn't just the cost of educating, it's the cost of support, duty of care, and the whole wraparound effect for safety and cultural safety on campuses. That's essential too. I think that's missing in action a little bit from the discussion.
This discussion or the discussion in general or both?
In general.
Stephen, could I just jump in there? We've got a number of questions come through from the floor. I thought maybe if we could just get a really brief answer from the panel from a couple of these, we'll be able to move through them and also take more as they go. Andrew Norton, we'll start with you. Seems like the establishment of the TEC or ATEC is a critical component. There's a lot of policy work that needs to go on. What are the budget implications do you think this has for the present and the future? What are the risks?
Look, I think when we look back at the commissions of the past, there was high trust from the government in the recommendations and consequent funding, except right at the end, where that was kind of what led to CTEC being abolished, because they started writing reports criticising rejection of the recommendations. And whether that will happen in this more difficult budget environment, so the Treasury has told us they're going to be deficits for the foreseeable future, yet we want this huge increase in participation. So those two things just do not fit neatly together. And I think our discussion has already highlighted some of the old solutions to these problems, like more international students or higher student contributions. We don't have those options anymore. So it is going to be difficult to do this. Tim?
Thank you. Michelle, a question about community and I think it's really relevant to the concept that the Indigenous community at the heart of the higher education system. The Accord calls for better interaction between research results and end users, community, government, NGOs, etc. How might the new ATEC influence this or help shape better interactions? Is that going to be something you think ATEC should do?
Yeah, I think it's a role for everyone. I think one of the particularly impressive pieces of the Tertiary Education Commission is the fact that we're going to have an Indigenous commissioner. So I think that person's going to play a very big role in shaping the direction.
Michelle, maybe mention the fact that that's Tom Karma.
Well, I didn't know that until now, but okay. Excellent. Excellent. So congratulations to Tom. That's wonderful. But yeah, so in that case, Tom's going to have a very big role to play on that Tertiary Education Commission. But I think, you know, there's such phenomenal Indigenous researchers in this country that bring such strength to the research agenda nationally that certainly they need to be approached across the board. And I think, you know, the Indigenous academics, Indigenous community, not-for-profits, NGOs, etc., are all keen to contribute and to make positive change for the nation.
Thank you. Adam Shoemaker, what's the role of states and territories in the co-design and implementation of Accord reforms?
It's huge. It's huge. I mean, without a concerted approach at what could be called the national cabinet level or the meeting of ministers level, it will not occur, and it won't occur optimally because every state, including one where I currently am, Victoria, has incredibly focused strategies that have to align. And we've seen the benefits when they do. We've seen when people agreed, for example, National Student Ombudsman agreed, done. And I believe this is going to be where the discussions happen. So we believe between the education ministries and also the skills ministry and its link federally, and frankly, the same with science and the same with technology and the same all the way through, alignment is going to be crucial. So we are putting up our hands to say anything that states need to support this argument, we'll be there to provide it, whether it's research, modeling, and solutions. That's our job.
Jim, could I just cut in there very quickly and ask Jenny
Yes.
Dodd on that? State TAFE bureaucracies can sometimes be a little slow off the mark. And then there are inevitable questions of premiers with aspirations towards states' rights. ASQA does not have a national remit on certain issues because the Victorians and WA didn't want to cooperate. Is it all a bit optimistic just to assume that the Federation will be as one?
I think it's incredibly optimistic. History doesn't show in Australia that the Federation has ever been as one. And that's one of the intriguing and delightful parts about being an Australian, which we've seen over many years, these states and territories exert their role. Look, I'll make a comment from a TAFE point of view. TAFEs are owned, if you like, by their states and territories. They are ultimately, people who work in TAFE are servants of the public of their states and territories. They're public servants. But more importantly, TAFEs are part of the economy and the community development of their states and territories. So that is a distinction, I think, between universities that don't play in quite that same very deliberate part of the economic pipeline. So I do think I commend this government in many ways on being able to sign in our vocational sector a national skills agreement that hadn't been signed for 11 years. That signing of that national skills agreement was voiced in also those words around the stewardship of the tertiary education sector that the ATEC's also going to have, and that word stewardship comes through in the national skills agreement. I think there is a genuine will for states and territories at the moment to work together, but having lived in four different jurisdictions, state and territory perspectives must always play a role within a Commonwealth perspective. That's Australia. And I think we have to recognise what that means in difference as well as in driving towards a common outcome. I think that makes for a richness. I think it makes for great conversations, but I don't think it makes for easy outcomes.
Luke, the National Skills Passport, what's the next steps after last night's budget?
Yeah, great question. Well, not much in the budget, but it was mentioned to us in our briefing from the higher education officials in the department as a kind of already announced measure, you know. So there's a great opportunity with the National Skills Passport. I'm very keen to see it moving, but I will make this comment. There are things that we need to do to get things right, and there is a $27 million commitment for tertiary education harmonisation, and one of the elements of that is finally getting off the ground the wonderful recommendations from the late and great Peter Noonan and his panel around the AQF reforms. So we need to do some really important policy work on that. to ensure that, you know, we can have a cross-tertiary sector skills passport and portability of those type of skills. I've long talked about this in my career, so I'm very passionate about it. But I think we've got some now really good policy signallings in this space in terms of AQF and other data sets and things that we need to put in place to make that work. There is money in the budget, so tick for that. But we need to make sure we get off the ground, because how long have we been talking about? I mean, I think Megan, Lily and I were talking about last night to say that, you know, the AQF review is now so old it needs to be refreshed again. So let's make sure we get that moving as well, so we can get things like national skills passports up and running.
You're right. The original version was written in Latin.
Yeah. Could I just say one really quick thing on it, Stephen, just very quickly? I reckon this is a very good example of when we talk about harmonization and we talk about collaboration and we talk about bringing things together. Great example of where it could go. And Jenny was absolutely right. When you have a focused outcome, that's when states and territories can get together and sign up. But it's got to be seen to benefit everyone. And that's one of the skills passport is one where it can be. And I really believe that if we grab those opportunities now, there's never been a better time. It's like we've been wanting Western Sydney Airport forever. Now it's happening. This is like that for skills passport. Bring it on.
Tim, may I?
Yes.
Yeah, I just thought, Luke Sheehy, I'd just throw to you just specifically on the skills passport. I noticed that in your submission to the discussion paper, you talked about my equals, which as far as I know is up and running and a considerable success, the one created by universities and some TAFEs now. And yet that doesn't seem to get look like getting a Guernsey.
Well, I mean, obviously there's a little bit of a vested interest, Stephen, because My Equals is run by HES, which is a subsidiary company of Universities Australia, but nonetheless, yeah, I think there's opportunity for both My Equals, which I think has an international footprint now as well, to coexist with, a future skills passport. And there's certainly capability within our broad ecosystem here to do that.
Diplomatically put.
If I may, Stephen, I was on a panel at the My Equals single day seminar on Tuesday last week, and I think there are conversations happening with My Equals behind the scenes. TDA also said, let's not, in our desire to put in place a national skills passport, ignore some of the very good solutions that we've already invested in, and My Equals is one. And so we actually have to go from a base of, not a base of nothing, because I think that would be a terrible waste of taxpayers' money if we didn't start to look at some of the solutions that are there. Now, I'm not totally advocating that that is the solution, but I do believe that there's a lot of demonstration, and as Luke just said, there's an international approach now for which My Equals is playing. Remembering My Equals is a technology solution for what is the group that of 3 universities Australia that Luke was referring to.
Tim?
Andrew, we've probably got time for a quick question. How will the financially challenging situation that we find ourselves in impact the structure of the higher ed sector? Will we see more unis merging or more specialisation?
Well, apparently the Adelaide merger is going to cost $500 million. So that's not necessarily a good way to save money. In some ways, I think we are seeing some specialisation in the sense that unis are closing courses, I think. So the latest funding agreements have more rules about closing courses because the new system simply does not support internal cross-subsidy anymore. But we still have this pressure. People expect to go to university near their home. And so universities still do need to be fairly comprehensive, if quite not offering as many courses as they do now. Tim?
Fantastic. Stephen, I know we have a number of people who are have to go because it is a hard 3 p.m. finish. Do we have any final words? Adam, Michelle?
Can I just throw one? Could I just throw one question
Yes.
to everybody, whoever wants to answer it?
Yep.
What's your sense overall of the government's vision, although not entirely clear as yet, but what we've seen of it? Are you supportive? Are you sceptical? Do you think it's possible?
Entirely possible, but a lot has to happen on the contextual side and also in negotiations between states and the federal government, as Jenny was saying before.
Michelle?
That's fine.
Yeah, possible, but particularly in the Indigenous higher education space, they need to do much, much better.
Jenny?
Look, I think some of the policy settings, as I said, are now changing to enable a more united sector. I think that is a really positive move, and therefore I think it does bode well. I think there are a range of other things that are going to be a challenge, but I think we've got some opportunity there.
Mr. Sheehy, sir?
I think we've got to do some serious work across different sides of politics to ensure that all of these things, all the component parts we need for successful Accord implementation is not negotiated at 3 a.m. On the back of an envelope attached to a guillotine motion in the Senate. So what I'm hoping is that we continue to have really strong engagement from emerging political forces like the Teals and existing ones like obviously the Greens and the opposition. That's really important. And I think if we have some really renewed and refreshed messaging around priorities, and I think, you know, equity, First Nations and research are clear areas of priority. I think we need to engage on that to make sure that they come both up to the priorities for the next steps, but that we see the rollout of the Accord seen as in the national interest and a good thing.
And Norton, you've been looking at this stuff for 30 years.
So I would say some individually good policies, but overall very sceptical and strongly opposed to conscripting the sector into just implementing the government's policies.
Tim?
That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Adam Shoemaker, Luke Sheehy, Jenny Dodd, Andrew Norton, Michelle Trudgett, and of course, Stephen Badgett. Thank you so much. That's over and out from us. Have a great day.
Bye-bye.